Добрый день, коллеги.
Good day, dear colleagues. We're happy to see you here today at our third workshop that will deal with aspects of practical applications with program HEAT that assesses the effect of walking and bicycling on overall health improvement in citizens. Yesterday, we were getting familiarized with the basics of the program. And then in the second half, Thomas showed us how to actually apply this program and how one can actually use it. And I can tell you myself that it is easy to use and user-friendly program. The difficulty lays within data collection that you need to use as an input for that program, for that software. So I do hope that our participants were able to calculate themselves using this software and get some results. And I hope that our colleagues with their results, they will share their results, and we could discuss that within today's workshop paradigm. Good day, Thomas. We are happy to greet you. We understand that it is early morning where you're at. Moreover, we are super happy to see you, that you were able to get up so early in order to do that workshop and also answer some questions that we have gathered yesterday by way of the email.
Excellent. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it's even a little earlier than yesterday, but I did make it. And today the burden is on your side to be sharp and awake here and contribute. So I will do just fine. I will start sharing my screen so we can have a look at today's program. Make this bigger for you. So for the beginning, I'm very curious to hear from you how it went, whether you had a chance to try the tool, and whether you could report back in very brief, 1 or 2 minute statements, what you tried to look at, how it went, what you found, what problems or questions you ran into. Then I think we should reserve quite some time for specific questions and try to answer those as you submit them. So please submit them through the chat, and Irina will select them and pass them on. And maybe halfway through this hour, we can then shift over, depending on how the discussion goes or how many questions we have. I can either present you another 1 or 2 assessments that I conducted myself as more detailed examples, or I can also show you, give you a little more background information about specific features of the tool that you might have found, harder to understand or you want to know more about. So with that, I would ask Irina to moderate contributions.
Thomas.
Yes, Thomas. Allow me to start with my own self. I have used that software myself, and I tried to evaluate how much bicycling would reduce mortality in my town where I live. There's some inputting data. My town is located, it's actually very close to Moscow. It's nearly a Moscow suburb. It used to be a heavily industrial area where quite a few factories were functioning. At the moment, in our little town, there is no developed infrastructure or bicycling culture. Most of the people prefer public transport or walking or driving their own cars. And it would be interesting for me to recalculate by how much the mortality rate will go down if X amount of people will switch to bicycling and will no longer use the public transportation or their personal cars. So myself, I took 2020 data as basics from open sources. I got the population of my town. Unfortunately, some data of specific age group that I needed to recalculate from 20 to 75 years old. I was unable to find these numbers, so I approximated myself. So I would say 70% of the population would be within this age group. So, and I got the population in my town about 205,000 people. Hence, I got the percentage within the age group criteria that needed to be assessed within this software. I got 143,000 people, and I approximated, assuming that each person has to travel by bicycle about 30 minutes a day. Well, and when I have inputted the data, I have used the correctional coefficient of 10%. And the results that I got were annually the premature death prevention was about 205 people. And for the time period that I used was 5 years. I have reduced the the time span in program. Default was 10 years. I used 5. So within 5 years, premature death prevention was a little over 1,000 people. Economical assessment of human life for 5 years came up to about $900 million US. So these are the results that I got, and I do understand that that is very approximate calculation because I do not have specific data that we need to request from some official sources. Perhaps there is some statistics available or some data that government or administration can allow us to have. But yesterday, unfortunately, there was not enough time to get this specific data.
Thank you very much for this report, Irina. I'm glad to hear that you were able to make it through the tool and you did get some results out of that. And of course, I don't want to give you very detailed feedback on the fly because it would probably make more sense to play it through again and then see on the details. I think my immediate reaction is that to improve your assumptions, probably a first step would be to compare cycling levels to other cities, maybe in Russia, but if you don't find data from Russia, it could be pretty much, anywhere, any city in the world. And then it's very important to put in realistic amounts for cycling or basically for any mode you put in there. And you have to be aware that you are putting in an average number for the total population over the whole year. So if you put in 30 minutes, that is probably realistic for a very regular cyclist. If they don't maybe cycle on the weekend as much because they don't cycle to work or the other way around. Some days they won't cycle. If it rains, they might not cycle. So that'll bring kind of a cycling day number down on average. And then, of course, you might only have, 5% of the people, maybe 10% of the people cycling, and that brings that number down. And I understand you use the data adjustment, the correction slider to account for that to some extent, which is an excellent way to do it. And obviously, the ideal way would be to have as accurate average cycling volumes. Just for a reference, I think in Switzerland, and I'm trying to pull this out of the back of my head, I think the average per person in cycling is only a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes per day, because a lot of people do not cycle. So this does bring down that initial estimate down quite a bit. Maybe we can hear from someone else about another attempt to run an assessment.
Yes, Thomas, we do have another participant of the workshops that was able to calculate some situation within that software paradigm, and he's ready to share that. Please, Natalia Viktorovna, you can go ahead and go online. You could use video and the sound.
So the question is whether you can compare two cities, and indeed that is not the most elegant aspect of the tool. But if you want to compare two cities, you basically run two separate assessments. So you can run a single case assessment for the first city. It'll give you the absolute value of, let's say, walking in that city. And then you have to run the tool again for another city, because the tool at this point really only can pull data from one location. But so you run it 2 times and then you get the results, and then you can compare the difference between these results.
Thomas, спасибо большое.
Thomas, thank you very much indeed for your answer. While we are trying to figure out the technical difficulties with getting our colleague online, so when we are calculating within the software the monetization, considering the premature deaths per each premature death, could you explain to us how do we get this economical coefficient in that calculation? Could you please clarify how is it done if you have that information with you?
Yes, that's an important part, and I mentioned it yesterday that I owe you some explanations on that. And this is indeed one of the challenging aspects of this kind of work. We are primarily interested in improving people's health, but to achieve these goals, it costs money to invest in infrastructure. Transportation budgets have to be divvied up between different projects, different modes. So there is a sense that you want to be able to compare and maybe also compete against other uses of taxpayers' money, basically. So what economists do is they value, they value small reductions in mortality risk. Not use the mouse here. Let's focus on this term, right? We are not saving one individual after another, but we're just reducing everyone's risk to die, or basically to get sick as well, by a little bit. And the economic measure that is used for this is called value of statistical life. It's a very problematic name for it, because people will immediately think, wait, how much is my life worth? And my life is worth much more than 1 million or 5 million, or I'm never willing to give my life away for that. So when you use it to calculate these results, be prepared to be able to communicate this correctly. So the way this works is economists conducted research in asking a lot of people how much they're willing to pay to reduce risks by a little bit. These are like surveys where they ask you, imagine if, your risk to be affected by air pollution would be 10% lower, how much are you willing to pay for that? And they asked many, many studies this way in many different settings. And based on that, this value is determined. And what we use in HEAT is based on a meta-analysis by OECD. So it is an analysis of many different studies summarized to an average value. And that average value in HEAT is then adjusted to your local country situation. So it's mainly adjusted for how wealthy the country is. Because, of course, $3 million doesn't have the same meaning in a very rich versus a poorer country. And so that's basically what the tool is doing. We are right now in the midst of revising this methodology. So the numbers you see in this tool right here are not completely final. So take them with a grain of salt, but it gives you a sense for the ballpark. For the magnitude, order of magnitude of this valuation. It is very much advised to try to find that same number, the value of statistical life that might be used by officials in your country or in your city. And then the other remark that I have to make, the tool offers two options to choose for this. There is a value that you can use for international comparison if you wanna compare a measure in Russia to a measure in Finland, let's say. These countries have different income levels, so there's an adjusted value for that. That's for purchasing power parity, so it's the PPP value. In the tool, it just says international comparison. And then there is the value at market exchange rate, which is typically what you would use in your local context. This is basically when, an imaginary example, when to build the infrastructure, you have to go buy the concrete abroad, you would have to use this exchange rate to convert dollars to a ruble, and then you would value it with this value. So this is quite a bit tricky economics behind it, but I think the key for users here is to get a sense what is used in the local context when you, let's say, you use this to inform the policy decision-making process. You should make sure that you use the same number as is used by others. And I'm happy to answer more questions on this if there should be more questions.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much for your answer. Well, we cannot overcome the difficulties, and I cannot allow this. We cannot get the speaker online, but I will allow the speaker to take my station to share her results. Would you mind?
Of course, go ahead.
Да, спасибо, Томас.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. We'll do that instantly.
Добрый день.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Да, отлично.
Yes, excellent. I took yesterday city of Kostroma. That town is not too far from Moscow, a very ancient Russian city, and it was quite interesting to see by how much we can affect the ability and desire of locals to walk. There are some towns that are further removed from center they walk a lot. The pedestrian infrastructure is way better, but the distance they travel is much lower. It was interesting to use your tool, your software, to see how it affects mortality rates. So I used the open sources available, statistical sources, that's statistics. It's official statistics, but it's open source. Population of Kostroma is 277,293 people. Also, I approximated the pedestrian population. About 70% is working people. They could actually walk to work on regular basis. I used the calculations accordingly as 6 kilometers per day. That would be the median. We use the pedometers and smartphones. When they recalculate how many steps you make, you get about average 6 kilometers. I got interesting results. The time span was 10 years. The actual software is very user-friendly, quite simple. There was no difficulty surfing from one page to another after data input, and we want to thank the engineers for that user-friendly interface. When you input your data, and you get very interesting results at the end of recalculation. Within the 10 years span, annually, we could prevent 593 premature deaths. These people will remain healthy and alive. So then we can figure out the economical effect. Unfortunately, it's on my other computer, but if my memory serves me right, we got an interesting amount. Over the 10 years, that would be almost $3 billion that could be saved, bringing the mortality rate down. Over the span of 10 years, the mortality rate, it will give us 5,000 people that would not die prematurely. It is quite interesting when you input the data and compare the towns, then using those results, they can use the results as a benchmark when making a decision on building the pedestrian infrastructure, when making a decision in facilitating the physical active lifestyle for the adults, putting together parks, workout stations, and perhaps pedestrian areas where people can drive in their cars near such park and then walk within a pedestrian park, understanding that we create infrastructure dedicated to bringing mortality rate down and improving people's population lifestyle in that or this town. I wanted to thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting, and I think we shall continue using that tool and share the results with our colleagues, and we would invite our colleagues to go ahead and use the tool to do the calculations and see what kind of decisions they can make for their own cities and towns.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this feedback, for this positive feedback as well. I'll be happily passing it on to the developers. It is indeed one of our key goals to keep the tool as simple as possible. It is not always that simple depending on what situation exactly you want to look at. But we try hard to not overwhelm users with too much details. Looking or hearing your results, my sense is you applied a one-case assessment where you took these 6 kilometers and you basically looked at how much they are worth. Is that correct? That you only described one situation?
Да, пока только...
Yes, one situation for now. You are correct.
Yes. So this is usually a great starting point. Maybe one has to be a little bit careful in interpreting these results, but basically what this tells you is that the current amount of walking that you have going on in your city is indeed worth that much. So you are comparing it, if you want to say, if nobody would be walking anymore, that is how much you would be losing. So I think it is a good way to really bring like walking and cycling, kind of these small modes, on the radar and raise the awareness that is actually really a big contribution to public health. In terms of when you then move on to say, okay, now how can we, increase it? Or of course, how can we prevent that it doesn't go down? I encourage you to run assessments where you do compare two scenarios. And of course, you will realize that the amounts that you will put in there or the difference between the amounts will be much smaller, right? So to increase, an average of 6 kilometers to 7 kilometers, even though it doesn't sound like that much, is actually very difficult in terms of planning and engineering. You really have to improve the infrastructure a lot. You have to improve traffic safety quite a bit, so people will enjoy it more and do it more. So don't be surprised when in these assessments where you compare more concrete measures and maybe more realistic increases or changes in the level, the impacts will be smaller. They will still be quite substantial if you compare it to the cost of these measures. So, if you get benefits of, let's say, 10 million a year, that is actually quite a lot for a city to invest into certain campaigns or infrastructure measures. So, but I just want to bring this to your awareness that the single case assessment is really assessing all and every little bit of walking, which is not going to go away, we think, right? People will always walk a little bit. So that's just my feedback on this case. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I'm glad that you also succeeded in using the tool. Irina, I refer back to you whether we have another report back or otherwise.
Томас, я просто пересела за другой.
Yeah, Thomas, so I'm now at the different computer. There are some technical issues here. So we received several questions in the chat, and I can see that several participants tried to work with this program, but they couldn't unload the results from the server. That's why right now they cannot give their results.
Yes. And do we have questions? Can we do like a question and answer session? Specific questions? I see at least one here in the chat. I'm trying to make my chat window bigger.
Да, еще один ответ.
Yes, there is another question.
I see there is one question regarding mortality rates. So if you compare two scenarios, whether you use different mortality rates. And typically the answer would be no. So the mortality rate that the tool uses, or how it uses it, is basically the baseline, or if you want, the background mortality rate of the general population. And then what it calculates is how much the walking and cycling will affect this mortality rate. Now, I think for a clean comparison, you typically want to assume that everything else that affects mortality, so basically, let's say how old your population is, and then maybe, other risks, that stays the same. So that is not necessarily true in a year where, a pandemic hits, your mortality rate is going to go up in this population. But I think for your purposes, you want to see what is the effect of just changing the amount of walking and cycling, and so you keep the mortality rate constant, and then the change in active travel will be translated into a mortality reduction. Maybe in a very long-term scenario, when you say, okay, compared from today to in 30 years or 50 years, you might want to say, yeah, but at the same time, life expectancy is going to increase and we're going to have a lower mortality rate in the future. Then you could consider that. But you basically would start to mix two different aspects. You could also then just adjust the results that you get and say, because we think life expectancy is increasing, I'm going to reduce my overall results by maybe 10% at most if you have like a long period of time that you're looking at. So,
Thomas, спасибо вам большое.
Thomas, thank you very much for your response. So far in our chat room, there are no more questions. And if you allow us, I would like to suggest that maybe you tell us more about other more advanced features. Yesterday, I studied your presentation and I saw that there are many more interesting features of your software, and I would like to ask you to tell us about them in more detail.
I could go through a few of those, or maybe I could also present one assessment that I conducted myself, just to give you a bit of a better feel for like a two-case assessment. I think that might be helpful for users. I would probably just do this based on slides because it's a little quicker, but I have a lot of screenshots in there. So maybe I'll show you one of those. And then we can...
Thomas, это было бы...
Yes, Thomas, that would be really interesting. These two scenario comparison would be interesting.
And then I encourage participants as we go along to just throw in questions or features they want to hear more about, and then we can go about this. So one, of course, very recent topic is the COVID pandemic. And I try to use this to inform a scenario for a use case. This is based on hypothetical data or assumptions, but in fact there are quite a bit of data, or to some extent this is hypothetical. There are quite a bit of data emerging regarding this. So basically, I'm interested in, and you might have heard about this, that during the pandemic, a lot of cities have put up temporary cycling infrastructure to accommodate people being more outdoors and less in public transport, and what we've seen in many cities, also biking more. So let's see whether we can get a sense for the health and economic impacts of this. So I'm setting up my case for cycling only, and I compare 2019, so before pandemic numbers, to data from during the pandemic, and I then set the assessment time to 10 years. So what that translates to is basically I am wondering, what if this increase would be sustained over the next year? So we've seen an increase in this pandemic year, and then let's assume it's not just going to drip back down, back to normal, but we find ways of, keeping people cycling at that level. So I got an interesting piece of data here from the city of Moscow, and that is count data. But it's actually quite a new or interesting way to go about counting, and it's based on surveillance camera footage. So there's many other ways to count pedestrians and bicyclists. There's technical devices that can be put in the ground or that can be set up on a post, and they'll count whoever passes. But of course, nowadays we have more and more surveillance footage, which is spread quite nicely through cities. So it's a very interesting data source for us. And so what they have seen is a 48% increase on weekdays and a 20% increase on weekends in cycling, where these, based on average, I think, of these cameras. So I haven't seen the detailed data set, and if I would conduct this properly, I would probably follow up and ask a few more questions. But I'm going to assume on average it increased 40%. However, what I didn't get with the data is a baseline value for the overall number of trips, right? So if you tell me it's increased by 40%, I have to ask you, well, how much was there at the beginning and how much is it now? And so basically, I make an assumption that whatever areas have been observed, they've seen 10,000 trips per day. And so this could be, it could be a few very busy bike routes, or it could be just many, many cameras in many places. Each of one only picks up maybe, 50 cyclists a day. So I don't know about that, but I'm just saying, let's assume whatever we capture was 10,000 bike trips.
Thomas, очень интересные.
Thomas, very interesting results we can see from you. Well, it turns out that even in such a very difficult year that we had last year, people still were not staying at home, and they were very active in their very active in walking and cycling, which can be considered one of the key factors in battling the pandemic.
Yeah, it's your colleague asked me that question yesterday, and it's a very fascinating time for travel behavior research, because we have many factors that go in different directions. Obviously, people work much more from home, so there was less commuting, less traveling to work. But at the same time, public transport was avoided very much. And then also exercise indoors was avoided very much. So both those factors really contributed to more walking and cycling. And we see it in many cities, or cities that have tracked it. So in this example, I will say I'm looking at the city. And I consider this assessing an infrastructure project. The reason is it changes a little bit the methodology, barely noticeably, but I am not covering area-wide. I don't know where these cameras are, but I assume they are looking at specific pieces of infrastructure. So I can't just easily extrapolate over the whole population. So to reflect that in the data, I choose the count data as the source of the data, and it asks me whether these are continuous counts or whether they're just short-term counts. And because these cameras run around the clock, I say these are continuous counts. And so what I'm entering in the system is basically I have to have a baseline number where I say, okay, and I could get this from the cameras. I just didn't get it in the email that I received. But if, when they count all this footage on the cameras, they come up with, like, in the first time, I'm going to say roughly 10,000 cyclists that they observed there. And then they told me that it increased by 40%. So when you do a two-case assessment, it'll ask you to input first for the reference case, and then in a second box below for the comparison case. And for the comparison case, it gives you the option to just enter the difference as a percent change. I could also just have entered it as counts, and then here would be probably 14,000 counts. But sometimes it's nicer to just have a percent change. And then you also see 4.1 here, and this is probably a little small for you to read, but of course, if you just count a cyclist as one, it doesn't really tell you how much physical activity they are doing, and that is needed to translate into health impacts. So the tool here proposes that the average bicycle trip is 4.1 kilometers long. And this is a number that we pulled from a few data sources. And this is a default value. Yesterday we had the question about default values. This is a default value that the tool suggests, and you can go into this field and change it. If for some reason, from a survey in Moscow, you have the information that actually they're only biking about 3 kilometers, you put it in there. And then based on this scenario, the results that I get here is that this translates into a change of 4 minutes per person. I didn't make a screenshot of the population that I entered, but I can tell you I assumed these are about 20,000 cyclists that produce these 10,000 bicycle trips. And there I just make the assumption that it's about 2 trips per cyclist. That is not really a sensitive assumption because he uses linear dose response relationship. It's okay. You don't have to get that population number right. It'll either be fewer people that bike more or more people that bike fewer, and it averages out to exactly the same. So this is what I entered, and this then translates into 2.4 premature deaths prevented per year. So you see, I'm working with a much smaller number here than you did, because first of all, I'm not doing a whole city assessment. I'm only looking at 20,000 people. You were looking at populations more like 200,000 people. And I am not looking at the total amount that they are biking, but basically just the difference between 1 year and the other. And then again, it is monetized with VSL. I have to apologize here because the value that I have in here is the one that you would use for an international comparison. So it's basically increased to be comparable, I shouldn't say to an American comparison. It's kind of like an international US dollar, they call it. So it's kind of an average, but it's probably more closer to an American income level. But so you would probably use the lower value that is closer to 1 million, but you still see that you get economic value from that in the range of several $1 million. So this is just one example for a use case where you basically do this. You specify 2 situations. And if there's time, or Irina as well, if you have like specific features of the tool that I should highlight, I could do that, or I could just go through another use case.
Let us, Thomas, would you please show us the example that you have calculated? And I do know that within your presentation, within the body of your presentation, there is an example of recalculation for Moscow.
Yeah, let's do that. So the other data set or piece of data that I received was about the bike sharing scheme in Moscow. Bike sharing schemes are very popular, popping up everywhere on the world over the last, decade. It's one of the most tremendous success stories in promotion of cycling. And of course, as a researcher, what we love about these schemes is they produce excellent data. In contrast to other cycling, these bicycles are docked to station, or they have like some electronic interface that is able to capture when the bicycle is used, because typically people pay for them or there's some sort of rental scheme behind them. So I have data for 2018 and 2020 for the Moscow bike sharing scheme. And I ask, well, what is the economic value of the health impacts that come from this bike sharing scheme? So again, I have to define my use case. You might have noticed that now in the new version of Heat, we have bike sharing as an option, at least in the advanced user interface setup. You can choose bike sharing. And what it does is basically it just changes the way how you provide the data to the tool a little bit. So again, we do a two case. Reference year is 2018. Comparison year is 2020. I am interested in the impact per 1 year, but then I also calculated for the 2 years. So if I remember correctly, I want to know the overall benefits and then also how much it increased. So this is the data that I got. 4.2 million trips were taken in this bike sharing scheme in Moscow in 2018. And I had to translate that into how many trips per day, because that's how the tool asks for it. And then I have data for the other 2 years. And I have an average trip duration, which was 25 minutes in 2019, and then even a little longer in 2020. And you can speculate that, in 2020, maybe people used it more for also exercise or recreational purposes during the pandemic. So maybe they took slightly longer trips. We don't know. And then we have numbers for the active users. So maybe those are members of the scheme, or maybe those are different actually tracked users. I don't know about that. Again, I am not worried so much about it because it doesn't change the result so much if this number is slightly different. So you don't need to know so much about how much people actually use it. Again, here, the comment about the VSL, you would more realistically use, or more typically, you would use the value that is maybe only about half of that. So let's not get too fixated on the exact monetary value that we produce here. So I ran two assessments here. First, I ran a single case assessment where I was just wondering per 1 year, how much is it worth right now? And then I ran a two-case assessment there where I was interested in, okay, how much is it increasing and how much is that increase worth? So how much it's increasing is going to allow me to extrapolate to the future and say, okay, so if this continues, then maybe in 5 or 10 years, it'll be that big. The single case assessment is more like, okay, before we didn't have this scheme at all, this is how much we missed out. So then I enter the data. You can choose bike share data as the data source. It'll ask you for the unit, and I have trips. So I don't have total distance, but I have total number of trips. I enter the total number of trips per day in the scheme and the duration of these trips. I am now looking only at cyclists, so all these people are cyclists. And I assume it's still the adult age range, basically all of the adult age. In the two-case assessment, I basically do the same thing, but 2 times. And you see that the number in the reference case is now higher. It is based on, it's again the millions of trips converted to per day. You also see that the trip duration increased a little bit compared to the reference case. And so I get the general results here. it corresponds to, and now I have to quickly remind myself, I think this is the overall scheme, right? So it only translates to about 0.7 minutes per person. Nonetheless, it results in 11 premature deaths prevented, which per year will translate into, if you use the lower VSL value of around, let's say 10, 11, maybe $14 million per year. And here is the assessment for the change. So the increase since 2018 is 0.3 minutes that have been added on top of these 0.7. So in addition, then there's an additional premature death prevented from that. So maybe by now in total we are at 12. And then same interpretation. What I have not shown you yet is the detailed results page in the tool. It's probably a bit too small on the slide, but the concept is very simple. If you choose more than one mode, let's say you do walking and cycling at the same time, or if you do not only physical activity, but you're also interested in impacts of air pollution or crashes, then the tool will separate those and you will be able to compare. So for example, in this example, and I wonder whether I have a way to make this bigger for you, I think this would be the better way to present it. You can zoom in here. I don't know whether it did make a difference, but physical activity resulted in 13 premature deaths prevented. But because you're exposed to air pollution while you exercise, this results in one additional premature death caused from the air pollution exposure. So the net impact is 13 minus 1. And similar for crashes, it's 0.8. So that's why we have on total, we have 11 deaths prevented. And it gives you a sense of the relative impact of the benefits from physical activity, which are typically about 10 times bigger than the harms from air pollution and crashes. Okay.
Thomas, спасибо.
Thomas, thank you very much for such a detailed calculation about Moscow. Looking at your calculation, we have a hope that if we'll have more cyclists, we'll have an increase in cyclists in upcoming years, then the premature death mortality rate will be near zero. Is it possible, really? Do you have any experience when that happens?
It's an excellent question. So, in reality, so physiologically, the risk reduction, and I should have a curve, I should have a slide in there. I don't know, maybe you've seen it in the introduction presentation, but the risk reduction doesn't really follow a straight line. It's not really a linear relationship, but it's basically an asymptotic curve. So if you sitting on the couch all of your life, and then now you start to walk or bike, you will see the biggest benefits and the biggest risk reduction. But if you're already running 2 marathons every week, you will not see any additional benefit from, walking 20 minutes to work. So in reality, the curve becomes flat, and unfortunately, at some point, we all will die. So it's not possible to become immortal. Now, the tool simplifies this, and it just takes kind of like an average linear dose response curve. And indeed, there could be a problem if you enter, 4 hours of cycling per day, you could become immortal. But the tool has a safety cap in there, and it'll just cut the benefits. I think you can cut the mortality risk by half. So that would be a very active population that really bikes or walks very much a day. It's under hardly any circumstances you will observe that. And then the tool just limits, and everything beyond that, it's not going to create a benefit. So this is one mechanism how HEAT applies a conservative approach to this and really limits it at the maximum level. I see we are almost out of time. I have not shown you in detail any specific of the additional features, but I hope that the two use cases that I presented you gave you a little bit a sense for it and maybe a curiosity to explore those further. The idea is that the tool is self-explanatory and that if you play with it, you should see enough explanations that help you to go through it. If not, you can always, first of all, get back to us, contact us with questions, but then you also have various links in the tool and on the website that should lead you to more information. With that,
Thomas.
I think there are...
Thomas, thank you very much. We have 2 questions in our chat from our participants.
Вы видите их?
Can you see them?
I can see the one about the 10-year prediction. So you could also, for a single use case, you can just say how much is our current level of walking worth? That is the question basically of the single use case. It's kind of a status quo assessment. And the assessment time is just going to tell you over how many years this should be added up. So you can do that over 10 years. It's just going to be 10 times more. It's not necessarily too informative. And so typically you just want to know for 1 year and say every year our walking, contributes these, maybe, 100 million in prevented health or in economic value. But it's more sensible to do it in a scenario where you compare 2 cases because there is a change happening, right? So let's say we invest 50 million in the first year into infrastructure, and we see that cycling will increase maybe just a little bit over the first 3 years. You will specify that from year 1 to year 3, it'll increase, but you will not get the return of the investments already in these first 3 years. But you will say, okay, the way we plan, we want to make calculations over 10 years, or in some cases over 30 years. If you build a automobile infrastructure, the calculations are over 30 or 50 years. So you will say, to compare this project to another infrastructure investment project, I want to set my time horizon to 10 years or maybe 25 years, and I calculate over this lifetime of the project, if you want, you will add up all the benefits. And then the tool will do this, because if you do it yourself, it's a little trickier because it increases at the beginning. So at the beginning, the impacts are lower, and then they max out, and then it'll add up the maximum. So it makes much more sense in a 2-case comparison. So kind of current state and then future scenario type of assessment. There's also a question regarding the...
Да, еще один.
Yes, another one.
Yes, there's the question about the population. And that indeed is one that can be a little bit confusing. I can pull up this slide quickly if you bear with me. But this is basically the logic behind this population question. And, in the end, there's no real difference between general population and pedestrians and cyclists, right? We're all pedestrians one or the other way. And some of us are even cyclists, not all of us for sure, but they're part of the general population. But why the tool distinguishes this is kind of to help you out. It has very much to do with the data sources. So where do you get your data from? And let's say you have a survey, and that survey tells you on average, people bike 2 minutes a day. Then this is a general population number, because there's no cyclist that only bikes 2 minutes per day. The cyclist, once they bike, it's closer to maybe 20 minutes or 30 minutes a day. But in the general population, you have a lot of non-cyclists that put in zeros in that survey. So you have to understand whether the number that you get from your data is an average for everyone in your whole city. So typically it's going to be a lower number, especially for cycling. For walking, difference is not so big. But for cycling, that number is going to be very low. But you will be able to apply it to a large population size. So for this scenario where the average is only 1 or 2 minutes per day, you will multiply it with 200,000 people. But in the other example, when you put in 30 minutes of cycling per day, or I don't know, Irina, try to recall your number that you use, but basically if you have a large number, then you will only apply to the cyclists, and that those cyclists might only be like 1 or 2% of the population, so you will multiply it with a smaller population. So this is the thing to get right. Data source is linked to the population type or the population size that you put in. So this indeed can be a little bit confusing and a little bit tricky, but if you work with real data, you will understand the difference, because you will ask, if someone sends you that data, you will ask, well, who is this for, right? Is it for everyone, or is it just so other examples for cyclist data are if you stand, the bike sharing scheme, of course, is an example. But another one is if you stand at the infrastructure, let's say a popular bike trail along the river where there's a lot of cyclists traveling, and you stand there and you flag people down and you say, hey, are you willing to fill out a quick survey? They will tell you, but then you'll be dealing with a population of just cyclists or just pedestrians, and they'll give you much higher numbers than all the people that are, sitting at home on the couch and that you don't pick up when you're out on that infrastructure. I am checking whether there's another question.
Thank you, Thomas. We understand those people that sit on the sofas at home, they will slowly switch to a different category into pedestrians or cyclists. But we have another question. In Moscow, and not only in Moscow, but also in different regions of Russian Federation and also in Europe, there's huge popularity increase in scooters because they have high mobility, they're pretty portable. A lot of people use these scooters for health improvement reasons. And we're not talking about electric scooters, which are also popular. But can we theoretically or hypothetically consider using a scooter and compare it to using a bicycle, and also input this data, and by how much the data that we'll get, just how precise the results will get or informative will get, or is it absolutely impossible?
It's definitely not absolutely impossible. You can do it. The tool does not accommodate it yet, so you would have to cheat a little bit. And, in your scooter assessment, you would still choose cycling as a mode. The big challenges are, do you have good data on scooter usage? So in a typical travel survey, are they already asking about scooter usage? I know in Switzerland they are asking that, in fact, but it's not a very well-established mode yet, so it might be hard to find the data. But let's say, for example, from the surveillance cameras, right? You can count the scooters on there too, okay? And then maybe you conduct a survey with scooter users and they tell you, oh yeah, my trips are typically, 1.5 kilometers long or something. So you would have to very closely look at the default values that are used, typically trip distance. And then the other, I think, probably missing piece from research is we don't have a good sense, at least I don't have a good sense, how physically intense it is to use a scooter. Is it more strenuous than biking? Is it about the same? Is it more like walking? And so there you have to make an estimate. You have to take an assumption. And then you would overwrite that parameter. That parameter, I believe, shows up or will show up in the parameter review table. So this is where we put default parameters, kind of the little numbers that go in the calculation that you can look at and still change, but we don't really show them very big in the user interface. So you would have to adjust that. Let's say if you think, it's not as hard to ride a scooter. I think it's harder to ride a scooter than cycling. So maybe you would increase this value. It's called the MET value, metabolic equivalent of task. It's really the measure for how physically intense an activity is. And the other way you could handle it is you could just adjust your results and say, it's only half as strenuous to ride a scooter, and then just reduce your overall cycling results. And then, yes, you would get an estimate. So you see, you have to take a few assumptions there. So, don't try to sell it as highly accurate research. But I think to get a sense of whether scooters are relevant in this mix of active transportation or not, it could absolutely be done. Yeah. If you try it, let me know. I'm curious to see the results.
Yes, we should try, because there's a system of bicycle and scooter rental system and scooter share system as well. And if we'll call on our colleagues in Department of Transport and we'll request that data from them, perhaps we'll be able to calculate the results, and then we'll be ready to share with you the results that we'll get.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. And this is a rental system it's not electric scooters.
Yes, those are electric scooters.
Yeah. So, with the electric scooters, the question becomes even harder. Is it still physical activity? Maybe a little bit, maybe, I don't know. We really don't know, because the electric scooters are even more recent and they're probably much less physical activity than, let's say, walking or biking.
Yes, Thomas, you are correct, but still, we should get certain results, and they should be interesting.
Yeah, and then, of course, you can, and we haven't talked about this very much, but for all travel modes that you think they substitute for car trips mostly, and this can be in combination with public transit. But if you have a scenario where you say, because people now have a scooter, they use public transport more because it's easier for them to get to public transport, and with that they replace a car trip, then you can use the tool and calculate the carbon emission reductions from reducing the car travel. So that would also be a very reasonable scenario to calculate with the scooters. So, as a closing remark, the tool is quite versatile in how you want to use it. what you want to use it for. It can get maybe a little more complicated when you go into very tricky use cases, but it should accommodate everything that results in a change in active travel modes and to some extent in motorized modes as well. So I really encourage you to play with it, see whether you can translate those, daily questions you have about how much of a difference does it make, and play with the tool. And if you have questions, you can contact us. If you have general feedback for the tool where you're just like, okay, on this page something is not really good, but you don't really need an answer for it, there is a built-in feedback mode in the tool that you can activate at the beginning, and then it gives you the possibility to send us, almost like technical feedback of like, on this page you should explain this word better, or you should change something. So that we appreciate as well, but we will not get back to you with an immediate response. So this is more kind of like a long-term collection of feedback. But with that, if there aren't any other
Спасибо
questions...
большое за такой...
Thank you, Thomas, for this very practical workshop. I see that in our chat there are no more questions, but I think that they might pop up when people get to study your presentation in more details, and as you allowed us to send it to other participants. It has been a really wonderful workshop from you. We've had really great time during this 1 hour, and I know that it will be very useful for all the participants, and they will all make the right conclusions, and even some people who probably never walked or cycled before will probably think about doing so after your workshop, about your very motivational speech and presentation, and thus the participants will increase the number of walkers and cyclists in our country.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present, and I really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm for the tool. I put together a few concluding remarks here, but I really maybe want to just point this last point out here to the participants that, as much as it is a calculator and a tool that crunches numbers, you should really also think of the tool as kind of like a door opener and a conversation starter. It can really help raise the awareness of active travel, the awareness about the health benefits that come from it, the magnitude of those, and then of course more with regards to your technical colleagues, it does raise the awareness for the need of data collection, which is really also something that we should advocate for at the same time to strengthen all these kind of efforts. I hope you will have fun and with the tool and bring it to some good uses. And we are here for you to answer any further questions should you have some in the future.
Спасибо, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas. And if we get more questions, I will absolutely send them to you by email or via the WHO and the colleagues that are stationed here in Moscow. Anyway, your workshop has been very useful, not only for regular people, but also for representatives of the governmental organizations who might be planning their work in developing the infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, and the walking space for the purpose of improvement of public health.